Hello and welcome. My name is G. Brady Lenarnos, and today's presentation is titled, I Lack Belief in Any Gods, Analyzing the Psychological Definition of Atheism. In my discussions with atheists, I have found that many, not all, now subscribe to a psychological definition of atheism and have rejected the historical and traditional definition. This psychological definition, whether you want to call it de facto atheism, weak atheism, or agnostic atheism, goes something like this. Atheism simply means that a person lacks belief in any God. It will be the purpose of this presentation to analyze and show why the psychological definition of atheism, namely, I lack belief in any gods, actually weakens the atheist position, making it virtually impossible for the atheist to engage in any meaningful philosophical discussion regarding reality from his atheistic position. Before we move on, there's a few things I'd like you to know about this presentation. First of all, this presentation is not an attack on atheism. It is not an attempt to prove atheism is false. It does not say you can't hold the position I lack belief in any gods. It is not an attempt to prove that God exists. Everything said in this presentation could be said by any materialist or naturalist. You might be wondering why a Christian would care about an atheist's position. Why would a Christian try to help the atheist hold a stronger position rather than letting him continue to hold a weaker position? Well, it's a bit selfish on my part. It's because of a friend of mine who is an atheist and who holds to this psychological view of atheism. You see, he and I have attended many philosophical discussions together and a number of debates between atheists and Christians. And whenever the Christian would clearly win the debate, he would say, well, the atheist wasn't prepared, or that wasn't our best guy, or the guy isn't a debater and the Christian is a debater. In light of those excuses, I want all atheists to have the best arguments and the strongest positions possible. That way, at least in the case of my friend, the above excuses would not be necessary. Building that stronger position starts here. Since in a few moments we'll be contrasting and comparing psychological atheism with metaphysical atheism, it might help if we have a better understanding of what we mean by metaphysics. When we talk about metaphysics, we're talking about one's theory of what exists and the nature of what exists. The importance of metaphysics is that it tells you something about how the person holding a particular metaphysical position will think and will normally act. Here's the important takeaway. Everyone, and I do mean everyone, makes metaphysical statements. For instance, the statement, the universe exists, is a metaphysical statement. It is telling us about what exists. The statement the universe is made out of matter and is impersonal is also a metaphysical statement. It is telling us about the nature of what exists. A theist may say God exists. He too is making a metaphysical statement. It may be best to think of each of these theories of reality as a set of assertions. Each assertion in particular to the set will tell you something about how a person holding that position sees reality. These statements about reality we may also call elements of the theory. Let me give you an example. One element you may find in a theory of reality is that the universe exists. Another element you would not find in a theory of reality is that the Lamborghini is the fastest car on Earth. It may be true that the Lamborghini exists, and that they may be, in fact, the fastest car on Earth, but we're not concerned with things like that. We're concerned with the big picture, with ultimate reality, with primary reality. Perhaps a few diagrams will better help us to understand what we're looking at here. In this first example, we have a diagram of the metaphysical statement, the universe exists. Here we have set up a category represented by the oval of everything that exists. Right now, in that category is the universe. There may be other elements in the category, but those have not yet been introduced, so they are not yet stated in the category. These elements, every element we find in metaphysics, have certain and necessary implications. For example, let's diagram and contrast this metaphysical position with the Eastern religious position called Godism, a view that says that only God exists and the universe is Maya, or an illusion. The person holding this theory is going to view reality very different than a person holding to the previous view of reality. For instance, one's theory of reality will affect how one views science. For the person holding to the view of Godism, science is just as illusory as the universe itself. Science can tell you nothing about the universe because there is no universe. In the previous theory of reality, the universe is very real, and the scientific endeavor can tell you much about it. With this in mind, now we turn to the traditional and historical definition of atheism. This definition comes from the Greek word atheos. The A, or the Greek alpha, in this case, is a negation. It means no, not, or not so. Theos is the Greek word for God. The meaning of atheos is then no God. It is a negation or a denial of the existence of God. As we shall see, this has been the normative definition of atheism for the last 2,600 years and is still in common use today. This historical definition of atheism is a metaphysical definition. It is telling us something about reality, about what exists, namely that God is not part of reality. God does not exist. Historically, this has been expressed in one of two ways. The first of these two ways is explicit atheism. For this, we go back to a gentleman named Diagoras of Melos. He was a 5th century BC philosopher. He's a pre-Socratic. That means he lived and worked before Socrates. And he is the first person in recorded history to be called an atheist. He was called this because he went around saying, there are no gods at all. This is explicit metaphysical atheism. It's a statement about reality, about the nature of reality. Now here is a diagram of what his position would look like. As we can see, Diagoras is not denying the existence of the universe about him, but he explicitly says that God of any sorts falls outside of the category of everything that exists. This denial is explicit. In other words, you don't have to do a lot of thinking or need a degree in logic to figure this out. It is plainly stated. The second way is implicit atheism. Here we're talking about another pre-Socratic philosopher, Democritus, once again around 5th century BC. And he said that everything is made up of very small, indivisible things called atoms. In fact, the word atom means indivisible. Democritus had no use for the idea of a creator God. Atoms are eternal for him. Thus, any non-material god or gods would be pushed out of the reality oval in our charts. Democritus did not allow for any type of a universal god, but he did allow for the Greek gods by saying that they were made up of special atoms that let them live long, long lives and have special powers. But they were still mortal beings. They were born, they lived, they ate, they drank, they had discussions with each other, they had fights with each other, and eventually they would die. This version of atheism does not have to explicitly state there is no God or gods. It merely defines any non-material God out of existence. Also, although the underlying use of atom is very different than what we have today, one can see the very basic structure of what we call materialism. Let's look how this would be charted out. This diagram represents the atomist theory that an eternal, infinite God, as you would find in like pantheism, panentheism, deism, cosmological theism, or cosmological dualism, just to name a few, are implicitly excluded and therefore do not exist. The idea of such a God, even if not explicitly denied, is pushed out of the category of everything that exists by the elements that are in that category. There is no room in the category for something that is not made out of atoms, something that has a different nature than the natural atomic world. The common point between these two views is that the implicit view and the explicit view are making statements about the nature of reality, about what does and does not exist. There is one other definition of atheism that we find in history. Now, this is a specialized use of the word atheism. It's not a normative use, but it does exist in history, so we'll go over it here just to be complete. I call this particular atheism because the person being called an atheist does not deny the existence of all gods, just some gods. A particular example of this is Polycarp and the Romans. In fact, this is the best example of this that we find in history. It comes from the 2nd century work, The Martyrdom of Polycarp. In the Martyrdom of Polycarp, we find Polycarp, who is the Christian bishop of a region called Smyrna. And he has been captured and taken by the Romans to the Colosseum to be tried before the crowds. And if he does not deny Christ as his Lord and God and accept and bow down to Caesar and the pantheon of Roman gods, he will then be executed. Polycarp was being asked to reject his current understanding of reality and replace it with another theory of reality at the cost of his life. Here is the exchange between the Roman proconsul and Polycarp. Quote, "And as he, Polycarp, was brought forward, the tumult became great when they heard that Polycarp was taken. And when he came near, the proconsul asked him whether he was Polycarp. On his confessing that he was, the proconsul sought to persuade him to deny Christ, saying, "Have respect to thy old age," and other similar things according to their custom, such as, "Swear by the fortune of Caesar, repent, and say away with the atheists." But Polycarp, gazing with a stern countenance at all the multitude of the wicked heathen then in the stadium, and waving his hands towards them, while with groans he looked up to heaven and said, "Away with the atheists." Then the proconsul, urging him and saying, "Swear, and I will set thee free," reproached Christ. Polycarp declared, 86 years have I served him, and he never did me any injury. How then can I blaspheme my King and my Savior?" So let's chart this out. Here we have two charts. We have the one on Polycarp and the one on the proconsul. On the left-hand side with Polycarp, in the circle we have is everything that exists. We see the universe and God. This would be his Christian God. We'll call it God X. You'll also see up in the right-hand corner there that God Y is outside of the oval of everything that exists. Then on the right-hand side we have the metaphysical position of the proconsul and the Romans. Here, under everything exists, we have the universe and God Y, which represents Caesar and the pantheon of Roman gods. We see here in the right-hand corner that Polycarp's Christian God is outside that of reality. But here's the common thing these have. Both are making statements about reality once again. Both are making statements about particular gods. They can both be wrong, but they can't both be right. These are logically contrary positions. So far, every definition we have seen has been making statements about the nature of reality. Now we come to the psychological definition of atheism. This is the definition: I lack belief in any gods. We see it emerge and become popular in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. Small elements of it can be traced back as far as 1877. The atheist and activist Charles Bradlaugh writes, "The atheist does not say there is no God, but he says, I know not what you mean by God. I am without an idea of God. I do not deny because I cannot deny that of which I have no conception." Although this is not an exact match, we do see him stating that atheism is not a denial of the existence of God. I refer to this as psychological atheism because the atheist is not making statements about the actual existence or non-existence of God, but a statement about his own subjective belief, a statement about his present psychological makeup. There's no metaphysical statement being made here. The person holding to this psychological definition will tell you that he either does not or cannot know if God exists, thus he lacks belief. Now, some will cite the Dawkins scale to illustrate what they mean. The Dawkins scale can be found in Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. It presents 7 points of demarcation of belief in God to a denial of belief in God. Dawkins, who falls towards the denial end of the scale, sets his position as a 6 on the scale. As you look it over, you'll find that the scale tries to give an air of objectivity by using words like probability and percent. But we must note that the words probability and percent are used very loosely, for there is no mathematical or probability calculations going on in order to determine a percentage or a probability. It is simply based on how the person feels at the moment. Once again, it is based on his psychological makeup at the time. There is no statement here concerning reality. What exists or doesn't exist is not part of this definition. Let's take a look at the differences between the traditional definition and the psychological definition. So here we have the two definitions side by side. And I think that will help us see that, number one, I believe God does not exist, is a very different kind of statement from, number two, I lack belief in any gods. Number one is a statement about the nature of reality, about what exists and doesn't exist. Number two is only about the person making the statement. It tells us about his personal psychological makeup. If you take the belief phrase away from number one, so instead of I believe God does not exist, you'll still have a complete proposition, God does not exist. The I believe is removed, you still have a proposition. This proposition can be used in a formal logical argument as a premise or as a conclusion. If you take the belief phrase away from number two, we have I lack belief in any gods. We'll then have nothing but, quote, in any gods, end quote. And that's not a proposition at all. What's left is meaningless. The focus of the traditional definition is on reality and whether God exists or not. The focus of the psychological definition is solely on the person's lack of belief. This is where the definition starts to run into problems. How is it possible to chart such a position as this? Well, let's give it a try anyway. It might look something like this. So here the person holding to the psychological definition is not denying the existence of God. He is only saying he has no belief. So we kind of put God there on the edge, half on, half off with a question mark, because there's no metaphysical statement being made here, just the psychological statement. Since the psychological definition leaves the metaphysical question, the God question, unanswered, many other questions must go unanswered as well, such as, is the universe designed, or is it a mere happenstance? Was man created with a purpose, or is he a biological accident? Is there an objective morality, or is morality contrived by man's subjective likes and dislikes? If we look closely at this question, we'll find that virtually every area of philosophy is affected by the psychological definition of atheism. When pressed on the subjectivity of the lack of belief position, I have found that most atheists will retreat to one of two fallback positions. One, I lack belief in any gods because there is no evidence for the existence of God. Or two, I lack belief in any gods because I haven't seen any evidence or sufficient evidence for the existence of God. When these positions are offered, the person holding the psychological definition puts himself in the spot of having to defend the positions that either there is no evidence or there is no sufficient evidence. It doesn't exist. In the first fallback position, the atheist makes a very specific categorical claim that must be defended. Unfortunately, it is completely undefendable. For the person to know that it is the case that there is no evidence for the existence of God, he would have to be omniscient. From an empirical position, how could he possibly know that there is no evidence in the entire universe, or even just on our planet? To make such a statement, he would have to have all access to all possible evidence and have a 100% foolproof objective methodology to determine what would be evidence for the existence of God and what would not be. The second position is a better position, but it still requires the atheist to examine so-called evidence and defend his decision that the evidence is objectively not good. This also puts a huge burden on the atheist, but in this case, not an impossible one. Just a really, really, really big one, as he will eventually have to deal with every argument ever offered. Let's move now to the psychological definition of atheism and how it relates to theism. Because the psychological definition doesn't make any metaphysical claims, in other words, claims about the nature of reality or what exists in reality, it does not negate the main premise of any theistic theory of reality. This implies that some sort of God could exist in reality, but the atheist just lacks belief that one does. Where the theist theories of reality can be the basis of a full philosophy and worldview, psychological atheism cannot. Let me restate these points. I think it's important because most people believe that atheism is a counterposition to theism. But given the definition of psychological atheism, it is not. First, we must understand that theists are making metaphysical statements. They're making claims about reality, about what exists, primarily that God exists. Now, the psychological definition of atheism does not negate that primary claim. Since the psychological definition does not make any claims about reality, therefore, it cannot possibly negate the primary claim, nor can it negate any other claim about theism at all. You see, the psychological definition of atheism does not deal with claims about God. It only deals with claims about how one feels about claims about God. Our final point concerns a comparison between metaphysical atheism on the one hand, which includes naturalism and materialism, and psychological atheism on the other hand. Materialism and naturalism both make statements about the nature of reality, about what exists. They both deny the existence of God. The psychological definition denies any statement about reality is being made. Thus, the two positions are contrary. They both may be false, but both cannot be true at the same time. Thus, the psychological atheist cannot rationally hold his position and materialism or naturalism at the same time. One cannot rationally say, I don't know if God exists, and God does not exist in the same breath. Given these two contrary positions, The practical implications for the atheist are clear. The atheist can either give up beliefs of naturalism and materialism and maintain the psychological definition of atheism, or he can give up the psychological definition of atheism, which then allows him to maintain naturalism and materialism. That is, if the atheist wants to be viewed as rational. Those who hold to the historical and the traditional definition of atheism have no problems maintaining materialism and naturalism. In fact, the necessary precondition of materialism and naturalism is the classical definition of atheism, i.e., that God does not exist. So let's do a quick review of our major points. First, the traditional definition of atheism makes claims about reality. The psychological definition does not. The traditional definition negates the primary assertion of theism, where the psychological definition does not. The psychological definition is primarily about one's psychological makeup. The traditional definition is not. The traditional definition is part of a full-fledged worldview, with a theory of reality and epistemology, etc. But the psychological definition cannot be. The psychological definition is contrary to materialism-naturalism, which prevents the atheist from rationally holding both at the same time. Well, we've come to our conclusion. Given this comparison, it should be clear why the psychological definition is a weaker position. I understand that many popular atheist authors prefer the psychological definition, even to the point of insisting that it is the only definition of atheism. But as we have seen, that is simply false. I would urge atheists to rethink the issue and take the stronger position on which they can make a stand, rather than the weak position, which leaves them out of any serious discussion on the nature of reality from their atheistic position. Before we leave, let me remind you of a few points we began this presentation with. This presentation did not attack atheism. It did not attempt to prove atheism is false. It did not say you can't hold the "I lack belief in any God's" position. It did not attempt to prove that God exists. Everything said in this presentation could have been said by any materialist or naturalist. I do want to thank you for your time and your attention. Once again, my name is G. Brady Leonardos, and you have been watching I Lack Belief in Any Gods, analyzing the psychological definition of atheism.